Yeah, we can move that out of the way if we don't need it.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We are expecting the lecture to go to about 8:15. We'll have a Q&A portion after the lecture. If you have any questions for Dr. Bauerschmidt, you can scan this QR code that will be shown. Two more reminders. This lecture is going to be recorded, so you can look at that on the Berry College Chaplain's Office YouTube page. And also, please make sure to silence your cell phones. That way we can give our guest speaker our full attention. With that being said, I would like to begin with this verse, 1 John 4:7-8. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. I have the great privilege of welcoming our guest speaker, Dr. Frederick Bauerschmidt. Dr. Bauerschmidt is a theology professor at Loyola University in Maryland. He has authored several books, including How Beautiful the World Can Be, Christian Reflections on the Everyday, and Catholic Theology, an Introduction. In his book that he'll be discussing tonight, The Love That Is God, An Invitation to Christian Faith, he emphasizes the central claim in Christianity that God is love. He explains that this love is not just sentimental, but also profound and transformative. The book also looks into how love is revealed through life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and how it calls Christians to live out their faith according to the example that Jesus Christ has set. Join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Dr. Frederick Bauerschmidt.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. It's an impressive turnout. I mean, not that I'm impressed with myself, I'm impressed with you and Barry. So I'm gonna talk sort of around my book and about a particular subtext in my book. I'm gonna kind of make an overt text. So I wrote a book about God and love, and when I wrote it, I chose for an epigraph a line from Friedrich Nietzsche's polemical work, The Antichrist. And the quotation that's the epigraph for the book is, "God on the cross is the fearful hidden meaning behind this symbol still understood." Now, at least to my knowledge, this choice has not garnered a lot of attention, perhaps because epigraphs are tucked away in the beginning of the book and people just page past them, trying to get to the heart of the matter. But for me, choosing this epigraph was meant to signal that this book was part of a many decades-long conversation that I've been having with Nietzsche. I bring lots of other people into the conversation in the course of the book: Aristotle, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, Julian of Norwich, Catherine of Siena, Thomas Hobbes, John Henry Newman, but the main argument is between me and Nietzsche. And this is because reading Nietzsche when I was just about your age, when I was an undergraduate, was an experience that shook me to my core. And I have ever since heard his voice whispering in the back of my head saying, maybe Christianity isn't what it says it is. Maybe we've forgotten the fearful meaning of God on a cross. To encounter Nietzsche is to encounter a critic who hates Christianity, but not because it's filled with hypocrites who do not practice what they preach, or because it's contrary to modern science, or because its morality is old-fashioned and rigid and unenlightened. But he's a critic because he believes Christianity undermines all that is good and noble about human beings, turns them into mealy-mouthed little moralists who seek to exact vengeance on the strong of the world by exalting weakness, by deifying death, Thus, Nietzsche's remark about the fearful hidden meaning of God on the cross. So in what I'm going to say to you this evening, I want to spell out at some length what I take Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity to be, so that we're all kind of on the same page, right? That we have some understanding of, well, what is it exactly that Nietzsche has to say about Christianity? And then I want to say what I think is true about this criticism, what's worth learning from. And finally, I want to suggest an alternative to what Nietzsche calls the will to power. I want to suggest that there might be a kind of will to weakness, and that that is part of what Christianity is all about. So, the first part, Nietzsche, the will to power, and the morality of lambs. So Nietzsche holds that all life is a manifestation of what he calls the will to power. And he means by this not simply that we human beings have desires that we will to fulfill, but rather that we as beings are constituted by our willing. And the human will desires nothing other than its own increase. We don't, as people like Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas would have said, will something because it's good, but rather the good is whatever we will. It's our willing that creates values like good and evil. Will is not so much our ability to make choices as it is a force that courses through us, that creates us, that ceaselessly asserts itself. Now you can see, I think, that what this does is to call into question any notion of an immutable good or evil. These aren't values that we find, according to Nietzsche, they're values that we invent. And in his late work, The Antichrist, one of the last things he wrote, he sums up the heart of his philosophy. So this is a quote from Nietzsche. What is good? All that increases the feeling of power, will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. And what is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that a resistance is overcome. So for Nietzsche, the will to power is the universal force behind all human activity. It's not something that we as subjects exercise, but it's what makes us subjects. It has no goal or purpose apart from its own activity. Now, for those who are strong, it manifests itself in the sort of deeds of power that forged great civilizations and cultures in the past, that continues in our own day to create great works of art or enduring works of genius. But in those who are weak, those whom Nietzsche calls the herd, it manifests itself in resentment against the strong. And Nietzsche typically uses the French word, ressentiment. So I'm not just trying to be pretentious when I talk about ressentiment, I'm going to throw in a French word. He actually tends to use the French word. The strong who reject the morality of the herd, excuse me, are those, he says, who have seized the right to create values. But his point is that everyone, whether you're weak or whether you're strong, you're driven by the will to power. The weak, however, have learned that in order to exercise their will to power, and you have no choice but to exercise your will to power, according to Nietzsche. You don't choose to exercise it. You simply exercise it. But the weak must mask their will to power because in an open contest with the strong, obviously the weak are going to lose. they are the lambs, and the strong are the predatory raptors that prey upon them. And it seems to be in the nature of things that raptors eat lambs. So the lambs supply in cunning what they lack in strength. The raptors, according to Nietzsche, says, these birds of prey are evil, and whoever is least like a bird of prey, but rather its opposite, a lamb, would he not be good? This, too, is a matter of creating values. Indeed, it's what Nietzsche calls the transvaluation of values. What was merely bad, the suffering of the weak at the hands of the strong, which is undeniably bad for the weak, though not for the strong, what was bad now becomes what is evil, right? So there's this difference between bad and evil. A raptor killing a lamb is bad for the lamb, good for the raptor, gets lunch, right? But for the lamb, it's bad. But the cunning lamb says, no, it's not just bad, it's evil. It's morally wrong. And then wouldn't it be a matter of charity, an act of love, to point this out to the raptors, to get them to repent of their deeds, to make them feel guilt, right? So Nietzsche says the mask that the weak put on their will to power is what we call morality. At least initially, religious morality, reinforced by a religious metaphysics. And this involves the invention of the fiction of another life beyond this life, a life that we cannot now see except through faith, but which is promised to those who eschew the evil wrought by raptors, a life promised to the meek, for which a blessedness is claimed that makes this life seem like a realm of shadows. So Nietzsche says, when the center of gravity of life is placed not in life, but in the other world, in nothingness, life has in reality been deprived of its center of gravity. The great lie of personal immortality destroys all reason, all naturalness in instinct, all that is beneficent, that is life-furthering, that pledges for the future in instincts, henceforth excites mistrust. So for Nietzsche, heaven is nothing but a slander against life. But the weak herd defeats the strong by convincing them that this heavenly life is the true life. And that it is one that we gain not through strength, but through meekness, not through exerting our natural will to power, to dominate, but by suppressing it. But this too is a manifestation of the will to power. The will to power manifests itself in the creation of forms of religion intended to defeat the strong by infecting them with guilt and commending values of pity and mercy, a morality of and for slaves. Nietzsche says the slave revolt in morality begins when ressentiment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. And this slave morality defeats the master, tames the beast, by convincing him of the holiness of slavery and submission to God. Now, Nietzsche sees the origins of this slave morality in Judaism, which, if you remember the book of Exodus, glories in the slavery from which it was saved by a power not its own, and which, in seeing itself as God's chosen people, creates a system of value that is the antithesis of all that is good and natural. So Nietzsche writes, it was the Jews who, with awe-inspiring consistency, dared to invert the aristocratic value equation, good equals noble equals powerful equals beautiful equals happy equals beloved of God, and to hang onto this inversion with their teeth, the teeth of the most abysmal hatred, the hatred of impotence, saying, "The wretched alone are the good, the suffering, deprived, sick, ugly alone are pious, alone are blessed by God, and you, the powerful and the noble, are on the contrary the evil, the cruel, the lustful, the insatiable, the godless to all eternity. And you shall be in all eternity the unblessed, the accursed, the damned." Now, this entire morality in Nietzsche's eyes is a fiction. But the problem with the Jewish God is not for Nietzsche that he's not real. According to Nietzsche, even an unreal God can serve the cause of life the way the gods of antiquity did. The only difference between Yahweh and Zeus is that Zeus served the needs of the powerful, Yahweh serves the needs of the slaves. Equally fictitious, but serving different ends. So the problem is that this God's preference for the weak, his choosing of slaves to be his people, his love of what Nietzsche calls the ill-constituted, the strange preference for the younger brother over the older brother, right? Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. Now, unlike the typical anti-Semite of his day, who sought to distance Christianity from its Jewish roots, seeing in Christianity a more enlightened morality freed from Jewish legalism, Nietzsche saw in Christianity the culmination of the religious impulse of Judaism. He says Christianity can only be understood if one understands the soil out of which it has grown. It is not a counter-movement to Jewish instinct. It is rather the logical consequence of it, a further inference in its awe-inspiring logic. He thinks this logic inspires awe not because it's good or true, just because it's so audacious, right? So the Jewish priest shades almost imperceptibly into the Christian priest, who is the shrewd deployer of morality and metaphysics. The Jewish God who loves the weak is actually surpassed by the God of Christians, who takes weakness upon himself on the cross. The God whom the church proclaims as Savior of the weak, the God become Lamb, whose death the priest blames on the strong raptors. But Nietzsche thought Jesus himself was different, and this is an interesting facet of his thought. He says the church is precisely that against which Jesus preached and against which he taught his disciples to fight. So for Nietzsche, Jesus was a distinct psychological type, a person who is weary of life but free from resentment. Not because he's noble, he's not a raptor, he's a lamb, but he's a lamb who's so tired of living that he does not resent being preyed upon by the raptor. He's a figure, Nietzsche says, most often found in Russian novels or Buddhist tales. He sees Jesus as almost like a Buddha-like figure. And Jesus' teaching, according to Nietzsche, has nothing to do with life in another world, or about but about how to live in this world. It's not about redemption in another life, but about reconciliation with this life through acceptance. So what Jesus practiced and encouraged his followers to practice was what Nietzsche calls a kind of inner detachment that outwardly leaves everything as it was. The Christianity of Jesus, he says, is a way of life, not a system of beliefs. It tells us how to act, not what we ought to believe. And so what is this way of life? Nietzsche writes, whoever says today, I will not be a soldier, I care nothing for the courts, I shall not claim the services of the police, I will do nothing that may disturb the peace within me, and if I must suffer on that account, nothing will serve better to maintain my peace than suffering, he would be a Christian. But of course, Nietzsche says nobody who claims the name of Christian in our day actually does any of these things that Jesus commanded. The way of Jesus is not Christian practice as we understand it, because Jesus was free from the resentment that's at the heart of Jewish and Christian morality. This is why Nietzsche wrote, and this is one of my favorite lines from Nietzsche, not that because I agree with it, it's just a great line. In reality, there has only been one Christian, and he died on the cross. Jesus was the Lamb of God who said to the raptors, without resentment, have at it. It's not Jesus, Nietzsche says, but Paul who can properly be called the founder of Christianity as we know it. In Paul, unlike Jesus, the ressentiment that generates slave morality lives on. All that would follow as the Christian church develops, notions of a future life with a transcendent God that could be obtained by grace coming through faith in Jesus, mediated by a priestly hierarchy, all of this is an invention of Paul. An invention, moreover, that's utterly contrary to the religion of Jesus. In the hands of Paul, the unique individual that is the figure of Jesus is transformed into the shepherd of the flock, the loving guardian of the herd, the creator of a new civilization. The very notion of a Christian civilization for which Paul lays the foundation would, according to Nietzsche, have been anathema to Jesus. But what allows such a civilization to persist? How could something growing out of this sort of resentment create a civilization? Slave morality is so profoundly counter to all natural, healthy instincts in the human animal that it requires a remedy that will allow the herd to function as a culture. The injunction to love the neighbor is seen by Nietzsche as a kind of safety valve invented by the priestly caste to allow for a kind of limited release of the pent-up will to power, allowing some within the herd to lift themselves up above those whom they serve in the name of Christian love. So your desire to serve, that too is the will to power. Why? Because it makes you superior to those you are serving. He writes, the happiness of slight superiority involved in all doing good, being useful, helpful, and rewarding is the most effective means of consolation for the psychologically inhibited. Otherwise, they hurt one another, obedient, of course, to the same basic instinct. And this is why early Christianity is characterized by things like charity to the poor and injunctions to mutual aid. It too is simply the will to power at work. And as Christianity evolves, it manages to reoccupy some of the civilization achievements forged by the higher types of humanity. He says, the type Christian resumes step by step everything that originally negated, meaning what Jesus negated. The Christian becomes citizen, soldier, judge, worker, merchant, scholar, theologian, priest, philosopher, farmer, artist, patriot, politician, prince. The whole life of the Christian is at last exactly this life from which Christ preached deliverance. The lamb who condemns the raptor becomes the raptor. Now, ultimately, Nietzsche won't completely exonerate Jesus. In his quasi-Buddhistic decadence fused with Paul's Jewish resentment, we find a toxic brew. Jesus and Paul, in a sense, become collaborators. Quote, they have led astray to the point of destruction the brave, magnanimous, daring, excessive inclinations of the strong soul. They have together promoted a God who is love and who asks of us nothing but love in return. But for Nietzsche, love is a kind of a hallucinogen. He says love is the state in which man sees things most of all as they are not. The illusion-creating force is there at its height likewise the sweetening of transforming force. One endures more when in love than one otherwise would. One tolerates everything. Under the hallucinogenic power of love, the nature-defying nonsense that is Christianity almost makes sense. And the association of such weakness with God renders a symbol that is infinitely malleable in the hands of the priestly caste, a God who tolerates even crucifixion out of love, and whose very tolerance imperiously commands the strong to become weak through the mechanism of guilt, to become godlike, where the most godlike thing has become the self-renunciation of the cross. He writes, the Christian conception of God, God as God of the sick, God as spider, God as spirit, is one of the most corrupt conceptions of God arrived at on earth. Perhaps it even represents the low watermark in the descending development of the God type. God degenerated to the contradiction of life instead of being its transfiguration and eternal yes. In God, a declaration of hostility toward life, nature, the will to life. In a strange psychological twist, the suppression by Jewish Christian morality of humanity's animal nature results in a degradation of the mind to a subhuman level because of guilt. An infinite debt to the infinite that no amount of human suffering can repay. Nietzsche writes, oh, this insane, pathetic beast man, what ideas he has, what unnaturalness, what paroxysms of nonsense, what bestiality of thought erupts as soon as he is prevented just a little from being a beast indeed. And this notion of infinite, unatonable guilt taints all Christian talk about love. Well, that's interesting. Remind me later. Let's see, hold on. There we go. Let's see, where's PowerPoint on here? Anybody know where PowerPoint went? Oh, here we go. There we go. Okay. All right. So this is good because now we're about to move into part two. What Nietzsche can teach you. So here's the charge. Christianity originates in weakness, the weakness of its Messiah. In deifying its Messiah, it deifies weakness, and in deifying weakness, it unleashes the ressentiment of the herd by making the will to power into a will to weakness. Christianity is like a disease that has afflicted Western culture, sapping its vitality and constantly mutating in order to survive. It proposes to us a will to weakness instead of the will to power, and love is the drug that makes such self-refuting nonsense believable. And for Nietzsche, even putatively secular modern morality, which thinks it's freed itself from the structure of Christianity, is in fact still beholden to Christianity, to Christian values of mercy and pity, values that deify weakness. So, how compelling is this charge? How seriously should we take Nietzsche's arguments? Now, I think there are very specific points on which you could criticize Nietzsche. I think his account of Jesus is one that's largely invented out of his own head, which he will more or less admit, but he says, I mean, the apostles invented their account of Jesus out of their own head anyway, so why is mine any worse than theirs? I think you could criticize what is sometimes called his genealogical method, this idea that you're going to defeat Christianity in the present by going back and giving a kind of a just-so story account of its origins. But even if we find Nietzsche's depiction of Jesus as Buddha or his genealogical method questionable, I'm not sure that this entirely draws the sting out of his critique. Without having to accept dubious claims about the origins of Christianity and Christian morality, don't we all have a sense that Christians have, to one extent or another, failed to understand and at times even betrayed what Jesus was about? And can we really say that Christians do not often respond to those who differ from them in ways that seem motivated more by resentment than by love? And can we not all think of ways in which putatively Christian morality has been used to engender debilitating guilt in people, to trap them in life-denying cycles in the name of being a good Christian? If we feel any sting as we ponder these questions, then perhaps we do have something to learn from Nietzsche. So I want to propose three things I think we can learn from Nietzsche. First, we can learn that Jesus was far stranger than we are usually comfortable with. There's a certain tendency in some corners these days to present Christianity as having the value of a positive cultural force, as a necessary element in Western culture or in the American project or in building a more just society. But Nietzsche asks us, wasn't Jesus just a little bit antisocial? The writer Paul Kingsnorth, who is hardly a Nietzschean, recently said in a lecture, and I quote at length because I think this is so great, and very Nietzschean for a non-Nietzschean, when we read the life of Jesus of Nazareth, in fact, it is impossible not to see a man who was, in some fundamental sense, uncivilized. He did not tell us to get good jobs and save prudently. He told us to have no thought for the morrow. He did not tell us to generate wealth so that economic growth could bring about global development. He told us to give everything away. The rich, he said repeatedly, could never attain the kingdom of heaven. He did not tell us to defend our frontiers or to expand them. He told us never to resist evil. He did not tell us to be responsible citizens. He told us to leave our dead fathers unburied and follow him instead. He told us to hate our own parents and to love those who hate us. Every single one of these teachings, were we to follow them, would make the building of a civilization impossible. These are bracing words with which Nietzsche would likely concur, and then say, so much the worse for Jesus. But these are words spoken by a Christian who feels that he cannot, as Nietzsche does, simply dismiss Jesus as a decadent weakling. In John's gospel, Jesus' listeners are shocked by his rather repulsive words about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, and some walk away, but others do not. Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of everlasting life. It is as if the very shock of his words wake them from a kind of slumber. We must let Nietzsche show us the strangeness of Jesus, not so that we are then free to walk away, but to reveal to us a fascination that is something more than having our fancies tickled by business as usual could ever be. To be a Christian is to let this strange, wild, uncivilized figure haunt our lives, constantly overturning the tables at which we are trying to exchange the gold of the gospel for some more readily accepted currency. Second, Nietzsche can help us recognize how talk about love can be weaponized in the service of resentment. Now, Nietzsche took a certain glee in quoting church fathers like Tertullian, who spoke of the spectacle of hell's eternal torment as one of the entertainments enjoyed by the blessed in heaven, because he saw this as revealing the true spirit lurking behind all talk about Christian love. Now, we might be able to give some sort of acceptable spin to remarks like those of Tertullian. I mean, human ingenuity knows no bounds, but we should probably admit that we do know people who think this way, who let love of enemies be a way to establish their own moral superiority, who treat love as the shovel with which they heap coals of guilt upon the heads of their enemies. We should probably admit that some of those people are us. We see the cosmos as a giant system of vengeance in which our enemies' lack of appropriate response to our proffered gifts of love is just enough rope for them to hang themselves. Third, we ought to seriously consider Nietzsche's point about how hope for the next life might drain this life of all significance. Nietzsche puts his finger on a certain kind of dour Christianity that seems suspicious of joy, that demands that this world be a wasteland in order that the world to come might shine more brightly. Without in any way denying the sadness and horror of this world, or as Nietzsche did, naturalizing it, and without denying that we need a savior, we might still consider whether we have too readily identified virtue with a prim denial of life rather than its joyous affirmation. Nietzsche wrote, and this is another one of my favorite lines from Nietzsche, "They would have to sing better songs for me to learn to have faith in their Redeemer, and his disciples would have to look more redeemed." We should feel the sting of this. All too often, Christians seem more fearful of sin than grateful for salvation. Perhaps the least effective case for Christianity is made by those who forget that Christ came not to bring death, but to bring life. Third and final part, I want to talk a little bit about Thomas Aquinas and the will to weakness. So all of this being said, there remains something missing from Nietzsche. As much as we might learn from him about Christianity, there's a certain blindness, I think, in his vision. And this blindness, I would argue, is that he cannot accommodate weakness into his system as anything except bad. So recall his words from the Antichrist. What is good, all that increases the feeling of power, will to power, power itself in man. What is bad, all that proceeds from weakness. What is happiness, the feeling that power increases, that a resistance is overcome. In this view of things, one would never willingly take on weakness. To be weak is not to overcome, but to be overcome. Not to will, but to be subjected to another's will. Indeed, it makes no sense to speak of willing weakness, since willing is itself a manifestation of power. To will to be weak can, by Nietzsche's lights, only be a diversion, a mask for what is really going on, which is an exercise of the will to power. And yet, the willing assumption of weakness is at the heart of the Christian story because it is the very meaning of mercy. In Christ, God willingly accepts weakness out of mercy for humanity and bids the followers of Christ to do the same out of mercy for others. To have mercy is to allow another's misery to wound you. Thomas Aquinas, back in the 13th century, wrote, "It is a quality of mercy to regard another's distress as one's own, because to be merciful is to have a heart distressed at the distress of another." So, in my concluding remarks, I want to draw on Thomas Aquinas to make an argument for a will to weakness. So, in his Summa Theologiae, second part of the second part, question 30, article 2, for those of you who are reading along. He asks whether the act of having mercy implies a weakness, in the Latin, that's how I'm translating the Latin word defectus, whether it implies a weakness in the person who has mercy, whether the act of having mercy implies weakness in the person who has mercy. It's almost as if he anticipated Nietzsche's critique of Christian love as the revenge of the defective against the strong. We commend mercy because of a defect in ourselves that we desire to spread to others. Now, if you've ever read any Thomas Aquinas, you know he first begins by considering objections to the position he will ultimately take. And the first objection that he considers, I'm only going to talk about two because I don't entirely understand the third. It doesn't quite make sense to me, so I'm going to skip that one. But the first objection that he considers to this notion that mercy implies weakness is that since Christians claim that God is supremely merciful, the idea that mercy implies a defect or a weakness would commit one to believing in a defective God. Right? If mercy implies a defect that is in the self of the one who has mercy, God would have to be defective. And it seems that Nietzsche would concur with this, right? God of the weak, God as spider, God as void. The second objection that he considers notes that, as Aristotle pointed out, those who are weak are often the least merciful, which again seems to actually echo Nietzsche's point that the weak are actually driven by resentment, which they simply mask as mercy. So despite Nietzsche's frequent claims about the novelty of his critique of Christianity, Thomas Aquinas seems to somehow have anticipated it. Now, as Thomas goes on to explain his own view, he restates a point he made earlier that, quote, mercy is suffering on account of another person's misery. But Thomas is actually pretty realistic about human beings, so he notes that we never suffer for the misery of another person purely as other, but only insofar as their misery becomes somehow our own. And he thinks this can happen in two different ways. It can happen through our union with that person through love, the love of friendship that makes the one we love into, as Aristotle puts it, another self. Thomas says, so that we grieve for our friend's hurt as though we were hurt ourselves. I think most of us know this experience. But it can also happen through what Thomas calls a real union, in which we see the pain of the other as a kind of harbinger or anticipation of our own potential pain. So he says, in this second way, people feel pity for others who are like them, because it makes them realize that the same thing might happen to them. There, but for the grace of God go I. And in the second way, we find that the old and the wise are more inclined to pity than the young and the foolish, because the old and the wise are aware that they are not immune from misfortune, and so are more readily pained by the pain of others. Now, this is an interesting distinction, I think, because it seems to say that there are two different ways in which mercy can be rooted in weakness. This second sense, what he calls a real union, in this sense, it can be rooted in a weakness that we already possess, or at least possess potentially, the awareness of which makes us have a kind of sympathy for those who suffer. Now, Thomas doesn't think, or he doesn't say that there's anything wrong with this kind of pity. It can even be a sign of maturity and wisdom, inasmuch as it shows our realistic evaluation of our own strengths and weaknesses. But it might also be a sign of the sort of pusillanimity, which is a fancy way of saying having a small soul, the pusillanimity that Nietzsche condemns in Christianity, so that my mercy upon a sufferer is really a plea for mercy for myself. Thomas's reply to the second objection about the weak being the least merciful is couched in terms of this sort of pity. Those who suffer so much that they could not suffer any more will tend to be merciless because there is no additional suffering that they fear. So in some ways, this second sort of weakness he describes does seem to be maybe subject to Nietzsche's critique. Our supposed mercy for another is really a plea for mercy for ourselves. And in his reply to the first objection about God being merciful but not being weak, Thomas makes clear that it's only that first kind of weakness, the sort that is rooted in the bond of love that is friendship, that can be said to characterize God. Because God has no weakness, no pre-existing weakness, no weakness except the weakness that he willingly takes on because he loves us. For, as Aristotle says, it is characteristic of friends to want to share a life. And to share one's life is to accept a certain kind of weakness, a certain kind of risk. Every friendship is a risk. Augustine says there's the risk that your friend will prove to be a bad friend and betray you. But there's an even worse risk, that your friend will be a good friend and you will lose them to death or circumstances. You put yourself at risk in friendship. You make yourself weak in friendship. And Thomas says this is the kind of weakness that God takes on. This is the mercy that is shown on the cross. So to be sure, there is no divine weakness. God suffers no weakness except our weakness. Our weakness becomes his weakness. We might even say that the cross reveals not a covert will to power, but a merciful will to weakness. A weakness willed so that we might become God's friends. And this also suggests that we also are called to a kind of mercy that is rooted not in our pre-existing weaknesses, but which wills weakness as the correlate of love, and so shares in Christ's redemptive mission. As St. Paul said, to the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. Salvation somehow involves our friendship with Christ and in Christ, none of which is possible without weakness. Here we see that a mercy that makes us weak is the cost of friendship. But it is a cost that we pay with joy out of love. Now, would any of this satisfy Nietzsche? Probably not. His hatred of Christianity ran deep enough that he would no doubt see this as some sort of theological sleight of hand done by the priestly caste. After all, Nietzsche's the one who wrote, "Whatever a theologian regards as true must be false." There you have almost a criterion of truth. But I hope for you, at least, I've sketched clearly the alternative. On the one hand, a will to power that cannot will weakness. And on the other hand, a will to weakness as the path to joyous friendship with God and each other. And so we're left with Nietzsche's question. God on the cross. Is the fearful hidden meaning behind this symbol still understood? So now I think we still have time for some questions.
All right, everybody. Can we give another round of applause for Dr. Bauerschmidt? Now, at this point in the lecture, we're going to be moving into the Q&A. So if you have any questions for Dr. Bauerschmidt, you can scan the QR code on your phone and submit those in, and I will ask him those questions. So the first one coming up, it's on its way, but
Well, and send those questions.
Yeah, I guess we'll, yeah, send those in.
Don't leave me hanging, okay?
All right. Okay, so the first one, it says, you said you talked around your book. Can you tell us what the main points of your book are?
Sure, it's simple. There's 5 main points. The first point is that God is love, right? So I say these 5 things sum up what Christianity is all about, right? So the first is that God is love, okay? The second is that the love that God is not a sentimental love, but it's the love that's revealed in the cross of Jesus, right? So that the love that is God is crucified love. The third point is that we're called to friendship with the risen Jesus, right? And that this really characterizes our relationship with God through Jesus is a relationship of friendship, and not a sentimental sort of friendship, again. I try and be unsentimental in the book because I don't think sentiment goes down real well. You all are a cynical generation, aren't you? You don't like sentiment. The fourth point is that we can't love God without loving each other, without loving other people. And the fifth point is that we live out our love for God and neighbor from within the community of the church. And that these 5 points are what Christianity is all about. I cram a lot of other stuff kind of in the spaces in between those, but those are the 5 basic points. It's 5 relatively short chapters. You could probably, read it in a day if you were under pressure.
Yeah, thank you. And if you haven't seen, back there is his book that you can buy. I'll remind you at the end to do that as well.
Please do.
Next question. If Thomas Aquinas could speak to the modern church, what do you think he would see as the biggest challenge facing the church, and what might be his prescription?
That's a really good question. I sometimes, for some reason, I always think about Thomas Aquinas confronting the modern world when I'm like flying on a plane. I always think, what would Thomas Aquinas think about flying on a plane? They're probably like, oh my God! But, I mean, you got to realize this is a guy who probably, never traveled more than 6 miles an hour. That was like probably the fastest his body ever moved through space. So, I don't think airplanes would be his biggest challenge. I think that Aquinas would, Thomas Aquinas, so the Middle Ages don't often, there's like, the Dark Ages and all that, but Thomas Aquinas lived in a period in the Middle Ages where there was this great rediscovery of the capacity of human reason to figure out puzzles about the world, about God's revelation, about, these are the people who figured out how to build those gigantic cathedrals without any machinery, right? And so Thomas lived in a time of kind of an incredible confidence in human reason. And I think what he would say about the modern world is we seem to have lost confidence in human reason. Now, human reason doesn't have to be rationalist, scientistic kind of reasoning where everything is reduced to just calculations and algorithms. But I think we're deeply suspicious about the capacity of human beings to actually arrive at truth. And I think for him, that would, and I think he would see this manifesting itself in all sorts of ways, right? I mean, in what people might call, liberal relativism, but also in certain kinds of conservative authoritarianisms, right? Where, we're just going to tell you what to do. We're not going to try and reason with you about what the right thing is to do. We're just going to lay down the law, right? I think he would find these equally disturbing phenomena. There's actually a wonderful essay by a 20th century theologian named Herbert McCabe. It's a little short essay on obedience. And he says, in the modern world, obedience is understood primarily as submitting your will to the will of another, right? Somebody says, jump, and you're like, how high, right? It's kind of like, and obedience to God is understood in that way. God is sort of drill sergeant, right? You drop and give me 5. Why, God? Just drop and give me 5. Cut your son's throat. But I think for Thomas Aquinas, according to Herbert McCabe, obedience is really about reasoning together and listening to God together. But this is a view of obedience that actually thinks that people who are reasoning honestly with each other can come to a common mind about what is the right and the good and the true thing to do. And I think we've kind of lost that in our modern world, right? It's all, I mean, in some ways, Nietzsche is actually right. We all think it's all about power, right? Like, who wins the argument? The person with the biggest gun. And that's really counter to Aquinas' whole ethos, where he really thinks, human beings, I mean, yes, God is ultimately a mystery. The human mind can never comprehend God. We can't comprehend mysteries of the Trinity or the Incarnation, but we can certainly figure out how to live together, right? We can certainly figure our way to a kind of at least an incomplete happiness in this life. And so I think you'd be very troubled by what I would call the eclipse of reason in the modern world.
Thank you. All right, the next one says, what do you tell people who cannot overcome their doubts and fears that the message of Christianity is wrong?
Wow. I'm tempted to recommend therapy, but because people recommend therapy to me all the time. I don't know what it is about me. I just feel like we live in a therapeutic culture, and anytime I voice any vague disquiet about anything, it's like, well, have you considered therapy? It's like, yes, go away. Don't get me wrong, therapy's great for certain purposes, but I think, ultimately, yes, Christianity is about a risk, right? It's about throwing yourself into the abyss, right? Because the love that is God has no bottom, right? And to really experience it, you just have to kind of step over the edge and take that risk. And though I think as a practical matter, I don't think it often takes the form of an actual plunge over the edge of the abyss. I think it's sometimes little tiny steps. I think to someone who cannot overcome their fear that Christianity might not be true, or might be, as Nietzsche thinks, bad for humanity, I might recommend, just try praying for 30 seconds a day, right? Try praying and see what that does. Let's just run an experiment, right? And I think there's a great philosopher who's Anthony Kenny, who very interesting career, has written a lot on Thomas Aquinas, but he's an agnostic. He used to be a priest, left the priesthood decades ago, became an agnostic, but still loves Thomas Aquinas. And he actually makes an argument for what he calls agnostic prayer. He says, so imagine you're in a plane and the plane has crashed on a mountainside and you're there all by yourself. And you are 99.99999% sure that there is nobody within the sound of your voice. Wouldn't it be worth your while to just try calling out? What do you have to lose? It's a kind of like Pascal's wager, right? And maybe maybe my answer is ultimately the answer Pascal has. You have doubts. Well, Pascal says your doubts might not be actually rational doubts. They might be kind of irrational fears. And Pascal basically says what they later say in Alcoholics Anonymous, fake it till you make it, right? He said, just start doing the practices, right? What do you have to lose? Go to Mass, get some holy water. Pascal was Catholic, so those are the examples he gives. Like read your Bible, right? Say a prayer. Sit in quiet for five minutes. Pascal thought that'd be like torture for most people to have to sit quietly for 5 minutes. Because if you really sat quietly for 5 minutes and weren't distracted, you'd eventually realize, oh my God, I'm gonna die. Death is the inevitable end of everybody, right? Nobody has ever escaped it. Oh my God, what is the meaning of my life? So he thinks we come up with all sorts of things like this to distract ourselves with. But I think I would encourage somebody to actually just try some of these practices out and see if that doesn't address your fear in some way. So I guess I would kind of give the Pascalian answer.
Very insightful, thank you. Next question. It says, what does true, good Christian weakness look like in light of the Christian In light of the Christian vision, for a flourishing life here and now, not just in eternity?
That's a great question, and I think that's somebody was paying attention, because that's exactly the kind of question that Nietzsche should prompt in you, right? I mean, Christianity is there's something ultimately paradoxical about Christianity, right? So Paul says, when I am weak, then I am strong, right? Thomas Aquinas in writing, I think that's it might be in Galatians. I think it's in Galatians, but or it might be 2 Corinthians. But anyway, in Thomas Aquinas, in writing a commentary on that, said this is like saying fire grows hotter in water, right? He says it just seems paradoxical. And so I think there is something inescapably paradoxical about the notion of, strength being found in weakness. But I don't know, when I read Nietzsche, I find Nietzsche immensely entertaining. I find him immensely provocative. He's actually often an extraordinarily funny writer. He's great at scorn and mockery. But there's also a part of me that feels like, aren't you trying just a little too hard? What are you running from, right? What are you running from? And it seems to me that let me put it this way, I think we all, out of fear, create sort of hard borders around ourselves. And if we're ever going to actually connect with another human being, those borders have to become porous. And I think that is weakness, right? Think about like your best friends or the deepest relationships you have. Aren't those people that you feel like you can be weak around? That you can show them that weakness that we all want to hide. And so sometimes when I read Nietzsche, I feel like he's this kind of very insecure guy who's strutting around talking about the will to power with his great big mustache, and it just seems like, what are you afraid of, right? So I would say that the joyful Christian witness to weakness is a weakness that grows out of confidence in God's power, not our own, right? That we can run the risk of being weak because we have faith that we're loved by a God who has infinite power, who has so much power that God can, on the cross, join us in our weakness, so that hard boundary can begin to be dissolved and become a little bit more porous. So I guess that would be my answer to that.
It's very good, thank you. Moving on to our last question. Would you give us any advice on how to pursue Christ-like love as college students?
Probably get off all social media. I say that as somebody who has a Twitter account, a Blue Sky account, a Facebook account, but I was talking with some folks at lunch today, and I did say that I think the most radical Christian teaching, the most countercultural Christian teaching today is love of enemies. Because I think one of the things that all our social media silos teach us, and maybe you're just watching cat videos on TikTok, and more power to you. That seems fairly benign. But a lot of people get drawn into, Twitter debates, and the way the social media silos tend to work, it's like if somebody's in the other silo, you're free. You're not only free to hate them, you're almost commanded to hate them. And this is particularly true in politics, right? People who are our political opponents. I know people who will tell you, if you are not angry with those people over there, if you do not hate those people over there, there's something wrong with you, right? And this idea that maybe there's some foundation of good in even the worst person, and that we should not view our enemies as irredeemable things that need to be destroyed. I think that's in our culture, that's an extraordinarily countercultural witness. So I think already as college students, you can begin to foster that. One of the things, and we were talking about this just a little bit at dinner, one of the great things I think about Thomas Aquinas is he always begins a discussion of a topic with telling you the other person's position. And he presents what he takes to be the strongest version of that other person's position. And then he almost always, not always, but almost always finds some element of truth in that person's position, right? So I would say as college students, I mean, you, I presume, read a lot of things you don't agree with, right? I don't agree with Nietzsche. But I want to take Nietzsche seriously. I want to take him as somebody who might, even though I think he's ultimately wrong, might actually teach me something about what I profess to be true. And I see it as a kind of a love of enemies. My bizarre love for Nietzsche is I consider a love of enemies. He's my vowed enemy, right? And I think in what you study, in your interactions with other people, in your thinking about the state of the world, to remember that as a Christian, you're called to love your enemy is the most countercultural thing you can do. And it'll get people's attention. Might not end up so well for you, but it will get people's attention. So, thank you.
Thank you. Alrighty, well, before everybody leaves, I just have a few announcements. There is a CE credit outside. Make sure you've gotten that done so you can get credit for that. And we also have refreshments over there. Take as much as you want. We don't want any left. With that being said, y'all are dismissed. Thank you.